Okay, I think it's the top of the hour, so I officially want to welcome everybody into today's webinar. On the screen, you will see some instructions for using Zoom. If you're not familiar with Zoom, we ask that you please keep your mic muted throughout the webinar. It's over on the far left at the very bottom of your screen on that black bar. If you want to put your video up, you can do that there, list of participants, and then most importantly, the chat box. So please click on the chat box, have that open, and feel free to type in your thoughts and your questions as we go throughout this webinar. We will save about 10 minutes at the end of the webinar for discussion and questions, so we look forward to that. Jim, do you have control of the slides?
I do.
Okay, would you please advance the slide for me?
I did.
You did.
I just advanced it by accident. And
Oh, yeah, we're still seeing the original one.
yeah. Let me try this.
There you go. There. Oh, we got
Too far.
2 ahead, but that's okay.
Okay.
All right, so as I said, this webinar is being recorded. All of our webinars are recorded. There is a link in the chat box currently that you can copy and paste into your browser to look at any of our previous webinars. And this webinar will be found there shortly. So you can come back and see this one again. So today's webinar is a teacher's perspective on the NGSS, all standards for all students, earth science integration and the 3 dimensions. And the organizers of this webinar series, myself, I'm Aida Awad. I'm past president of NAGT, past secretary treasurer. Ed Roback, who I think is on the call. I'm not sure if he can chime in to introduce himself, so I'll just introduce everybody. Ed is at American Geosciences Institute. Carla McAuliffe, who is the executive director of the National Earth Science Teachers Association. Jessica Beam from UCMP Berkeley, and Andrew Havlis from CERC. And Andrew's our webinar guru, so thanks to everybody who's contributed to this webinar series. I'm going to go ahead and advance the slide again. Thanks. Our presenters today are Jim Clark and Samantha Johnson from Next Gen Science Innovations. And we will have their presentation. And then, as I said, we'll have some time for discussion, Q&A, and then we'll provide a link for the post-webinar survey. And we'll give you a few minutes to do that right at the end of the webinar because we very, very much appreciate your feedback on these webinars. So please hang in there with us and take that survey at the end. Go ahead and advance it one more time. Great. Upcoming events, this is a monthly webinar series, February 14th, Valentine's Day. We'll be here, will you? February 14th, we'll have an excellent presentation from Dr. Jeff Thomas, who will be talking about the secondary NGSS weather unit, emphasizing high leverage science and literacy practices in 3-dimensional learning context. So please put that on your calendar. Registration information will be coming out in the next couple of days on that, so watch your inbox for that as well. Okay, let's go ahead and move forward. Excellent. And I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Jim and Samantha. And I'll be fielding questions in the chat box. So just one last reminder to please type your thoughts and questions into the chat box as we go through. Jim, Samantha?
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Can you all hear me okay? Yes, okay, great. Well, I can't thank everybody enough for the opportunity to be here today. This was originally, the idea came from Jessica Bean at UCMP, University of Museum of Paleontology at Berkeley. And we've done a lot of work with her around embedding the Earth and space science performance expectations into the NGSS. So we want to thank her and Andrew for helping me through the trauma of setting up the webinar. And it's funny, I feel like it's more nerve-wracking to do this than it is to stand in front of 300 live people. So I wanted to thank Andrew very much. Samantha actually has class right now. And so she's listening in and she will chime in if she can. But most of the work she and I have done completely collaboratively. And in fact, the work couldn't be done without her input and her expertise. So I just want to acknowledge the fact that Samantha, though she might not join us on a regular basis, has been instrumental in the development of this work. So kind of just the beginning, we thought we would look at some of the goals of the webinar. The idea would be to develop a deeper understanding of the shifts that the NGSS is asking us as teachers to make. And if there's any questions you have in regards, please, we don't have to wait to the end. I haven't done a 50-minute straight talking lecture in years. So the more interactive we can be, the better. So if you have questions along the way, I'm happy to answer them as we go. We're also going to discover a roadmap to a classroom, site, and district implementation process. We'll look to explore ways to create equity-based activities in our classrooms. We'll take a look at using Earth and space science phenomena to drive our lessons in all of our content areas. So one of the asks of the NGSS is to implement Earth and space science phenomena, but not sprinkle it in, use it as the driving force for the phenomena for all of our lessons. So we'll take a look at a couple ways to do that. And then finally, we'll share a few additional professional development opportunities for people if they are interested in it. So if we look at the shift of the NGSS, most of you are familiar with it, but if it's new to you or you're in a state that's not an NGSS state, some of the shifts involve the idea that science should be for all students, not just some students, that our classrooms are a place where all kids can contribute and all kids can learn, which is different than in the past, and we'll explain that in just a little bit. Another shift is from teacher as the dispenser of knowledge to the student uncovering the scientific concepts as they go through the work. This is certainly slower and for some teachers oftentimes more frustrating, but we know from the research that when kids uncover the content themselves, they tend to retain it and are more interested in it. We're moving from the idea of hands-on activities, kind of what the word inquiry came to be maybe 10 years ago, to not just hands-on, but also minds-on. And for a while, I think hands-on became all the rage, and there was not a whole lot of minds-on oftentimes. And so the NGSS is asking us to do both, to move from a siloed science content to an integrated way of thinking. And that's not saying that it's integrated science. It's just saying that students should understand that there's a connection between biological concepts and the Earth phenomena that drives those biological concepts or chemistry concepts or physics concepts. The idea that teacher as a director standing in front of the classroom and delivering a lecture to giving student agency and voice. And that is a big shift that we have found that once teachers feel comfortable letting go and trusting their students, that they've come to understand that their classroom is a place of full inquiry and that students are really curious. It's just that they're curious about things that they're curious about, not curious about things that we tell them they should be curious about. So moving away from the teacher-directed classroom to student agency and voice is one of the shifts of the NGSS. And then I think also from moving from assessment, which measures oftentimes compliance and recall, to students solving real-world problems. So as our instruction changes, our assessments need to shift as well. And finally, the shift from science as a list of facts to science and engineering as a way to engage with and identify solutions to real-world issues. And so those are the kind of the shifts that the NGSS is asking us to make. Those aren't small shifts for sure, but they are shifts that we're being asked to make. And the first thing when we look at these shifts is to identify in our classroom is who's learning, what are they learning, and when are they learning it? Because if we can identify those things, then we can replicate them. I remember when I first started teaching we'll just call it 30 years ago and some, I didn't really, I could deliver my lesson expertly without a single kid in the classroom. And it never dawned on me to really be aware of which kids were learning, which kids weren't, what was I doing to make sure that all kids were learning. And so asking yourself these questions as we go through our content is really important, because if you're familiar with the NGSS and you know Appendix D, one of the mandates of the framework is all standards for all students. And we all have in our classroom all of these kids. I happen to teach in a district where we have push-in special ed classes. So we had lots of special ed classes. Our classrooms were a third of the class, a quarter of the class for special ed kids. We have a large English language learner population. We have moved to referring to those students as emerging bilinguals. So if I use that term, that's a term that we have just come to use, and it's become habit with me, but it means kids who are English isn't their first language. We have kids living in poverty, even in a district that's fairly wealthy. Sometimes there are kids who sleep on their buddy's car, in their car or on their couch because their family life just isn't very good. And we have gender equity issues, and we'll share some of the struggles that we went through in our district around that, as well as students of color and the classes that those kids were in. The fact that we referred to them as those kids was an issue. And then recognizing the fact that we also have a responsibility to the kids who have been identified as gate kids or kids who have been in accelerated programs that move into our district or come from our district. And how do we manage a classroom that is completely heterogeneous? And so the idea that all standards for all kids is one of the biggest shifts, one of the biggest requirements of the NGSS. And what started us really thinking about that was when there was a time, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, before we fully bought into NGSS, that you could walk into a classroom and by looking at the demographics of the kids in the classroom, you could tell whether it was an AP class or a non-AP class. And we thought that we at first didn't recognize that that was the case. And then once we started analyzing the data and having discussions about what does all standards for all students really mean, we recognized that you should not be able to walk into a class and by looking at who's in the class, by the makeup of either gender or the makeup of race, is this an AP class or is this a graduation requirement but not a college level class? And so we in our district decided to kind of blow that whole idea up. And we started by looking at the 1998 standards, and we said, okay, what were we doing to meet those? And we recognized that all science really, for us, meant all science for some of our students. That some of our students were in what in California is referred to as D-level courses, which are courses that are accepted by California State University systems as entrance requirements. And yet others were in G-level classes, which means the colleges didn't recognize them as high quality science classes necessarily. But if you have a 2-year graduation requirement, you could check the box and the student could graduate. And when we looked at the data of who was in those classrooms, we found that in the G classes that we had more females and more kids of color than in the D-level classes. And that was a wake-up call to us. We realized that we had offered a smorgasbord of classes, that we offered all these random classes with little or no coherence between the courses. So a kid could, if they didn't receive good counseling, or if they were somehow identified or self-identified as like, I'm not good at science, could go through their 3-year graduation requirement in our district and take 3 random classes where at no time was there really coherence, either between the content or even between the teachers teaching the courses. So that recognition of those things was really is what started our thinking about what changes to make in San Lorenzo Unified School District, where I was a teacher for a long time and then the science coordinator for the district for 3 years. San Lorenzo is near Oakland. It's right between Oakland and Hayward. So it's about 15 minutes south of the Oakland Coliseum. So it's a very diverse population of students. And what we saw in San Lorenzo, my computer's stuck here for a second. What we saw in San Lorenzo was that this smorgasbord of classes wasn't serving any of our students well. And so I'm just having a moment of technical difficulty here. My slide isn't advancing. We had astronomy We had Introduction to Biology. We had a course that was a chemistry course for kids who nobody thought could do chemistry. We had an environmental science course, which was a course that you could take if you failed all your other classes. And so as we looked at that, we said, those things, again, have to change. So I'm just trying to advance my slides. And they appear to be frozen.
Try backing up one and then go forward, Jim.
Back up one. Yeah, I'm not getting it.
You may want to try clicking the other arrow because it looks like that one's active. The black arrow.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm clicking the bell. I get a spinning wheel of death. Yeah, they're not wanting to advance here.
Are you able to escape? As in, did PowerPoint freeze, I guess is my question.
Yeah, I think the PowerPoint froze.
So,
there we go. Okay.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. Okay. So these are some of the classes. So thank you very much for your help. So there's some of those. This is some of the classes that we had, and those classes were all good enough, oftentimes for those kids, but none of the classes, even if a student earned an A, would count towards UC or California State University acceptance, but they would count towards graduation requirements. So we offered all these classes, and one of the problems was when the NGSS came out, it asked us to think of science as a coherent set of concepts. But these classes were divided into 3 distinct disciplines. Clearly there was life sciences, physical science, and earth and space science, but they weren't united in any way. So we decided it was time to change. And what we did to do that was we decided that we can no longer offer 3 classes. And then we had an earth science class or environmental science class, really was kind of like for those kids. And if you didn't pass anything else, but you need to graduate, oftentimes kids would be in this class in like more than 1 year. And we said that wasn't helpful. And we looked at our data. Here's a picture of what our data looked like in, for example, in physics and anatomy before NGSS. So if you take a look at that, I'm interested to have people look at that graph, and if you feel like it, type in the chat box, what do you notice about that graph, or what do you wonder about that graph? Because it says a lot about where we were 5 or 6 years ago. So if you notice in that graph, what we have is so many, exactly, right? So my husband is in physics and he only works with 1 woman out of 50. Very few, our peers or girls are not signing up for physics. Well, that's accurate. And not only were they not signing up, they were actually being counseled out of physics. We had counselors telling girls, well, you know, that's really for doctors. You should be, you know, maybe can be a nurse and you should take anatomy. And so we were running into all types of problems around this. And so trying to change people's perceptions of what, first off, what physics is, and second off, that all kids could do it was a real challenge for us. So that was pre-NGSS, and we got stuck in that mode for a long time. And then when our district realized, well, we need to we have to change from the traditional roles of kids in science to an equity-based science program, we realized it was a big leap. We didn't anticipate the pushback from other teachers and counselors. That was a surprise to us. We anticipated it from kids and parents, but we got some pushback from administrators and counselors. But the first thing we did was to make that leap was to start an implementation team, an NGSS implementation team. And our implementation team came up with this vision statement. And if you've ever tried to write a vision statement, it's one of those things that seems so simple, and you're going to bang out your vision statement in your first 2-hour meeting and then get into the important stuff. And it turns out that a real solid, thoughtful vision statement is really important. And this, we met over the course of a full year to develop this single statement around what we wanted the kids in our district to be when they were done with science. And if you notice, there's nothing in there about a particular content. It's all about what we want them to be as citizens once they graduate. And the way this vision statement came up was our NGSS implementation team was put in place, which I had the privilege of leading. Samantha was on our science leadership team. And it was the implementation team and the leadership team that was responsible for bringing our vision to the site administration, the site teachers, and the site support staff. And we would meet quarterly for 2 hours, and then every month in smaller groups to think about what that vision might look like. As a result, just like 3 years after we are fully implemented NGSS, we got through 11th grade, which is the grade we teach physics, which is now called Physics in the Universe. This is our data now. And why we are really excited that anatomy numbers are still really strong. If you look at the number of girls taking physics now, I mean, it went, I think the number was 7. I mean, a total of 7 girls in a school of 2,000 students to, almost 120 girls right now are enrolled in our Physics in the Universe courses. And so we really thought that was just a great, tremendous feather in our hat in order to get kids enrolled in physics. Additionally, we have a Earth Science class, which is actually a UCD level geology class. And not only do we have equal numbers of geology as we do chemistry classes, we have equal numbers of enrollment in girls and boys, both in geology as well as chemistry. So our district has really taken the idea of equity and that all students should be able to have access to all classes seriously. And we've done that by taking our physics courses and our geology courses and making them incredibly accessible to our students, and by educating our community and our teachers. The challenge was educating our administration and our counselors. Anatomy was, just look at a couple of the questions in the chat room. Anatomy was a level class, and it was a good class. I mean, there was nothing wrong with any of these classes, but what happens over time is that de facto tracking occurs, and pretty soon that really good astronomy class becomes the class that kids are put into by counselors or choice because somebody feels they can't pass another class, or the teacher tries to make it a D-level class and gets pushback from the admin for whatever reason. So it was a G-level class. And anatomy is an integrated class. It is anatomy physiology class for sure. And so the classes that you saw on the physics was not different grade levels. They were all, both sets of data were juniors. And so the progression in our district is that kids take the living earth, which is formerly known as biology, in 9th grade. And then in 10th grade, they can split and take geochemistry or chemistry and earth systems. And then they come back as juniors to take physics in the universe. And this is a number of kids that chose to take physics. And so we're really thankful for the number of girls that have improved our numbers in physics. So that's kind of the to the so what. So that's how we got there, but what's next? What happens after this? And what we were able to do, and I'm stuck again. Thank you. What we were able to do is think about how to shift the mindset of teachers, administrators, and counselors and parents. We thought about how to support students who have been led to believe, often through their own school system, that they are not good in science. Kids sometimes walk into our classrooms thinking that I'm not good in math, therefore I'm not good at science. And so if I could just get a C-, my parents would be happy. And we know that that's not true. We know that there's a lot of data to show that previous science classes may have been more about reading or section reviews at the end of the chapters instead of real science. And so kids don't even know what they're good at yet. And then finally, we thought it was really important to redefine SMART in a way that is more inclusive of the knowledge and experiences that our students bring to them to the classroom every day. And we thought it was important to make sure that we didn't talk about lowering the standard for whatever SMART is, but simply making it more inclusive. And we did that. We started with our students with something we call classroom ethos. And most of you are familiar with the 3 dimensions of the NGSS, the science engineering practices, the disciplinary core ideas, and the cross-cutting concepts. And that's where we focused for the first year or 2. And then we realized that we were still not reaching all standards for all students, that some kids still felt they didn't belong in a classroom, in a physics classroom or in a geochemistry classroom. And I came across the idea at a workshop. I saw this sign, was that there should be a 4th dimension to the NGSS. And it's one Samantha Johnson and I came up with, which is classroom ethos. And that's just the idea of building classroom tasks that are equity-based and truly group-worthy. That classroom ethos is the way we do things in our classroom. It is a fundamental character and spirit of what we do. So we think that classroom ethos is very different than class culture. Sometimes teachers develop their class cultures or their rules around what makes them feel comfortable in their classroom, but a classroom ethos is about what makes the kids feel comfortable in the classroom, and how to redefine SMART, and how do we assign status to kids in the classroom. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about what that might look like. And we really came down to what we identified as equity-based activities and labs must have these 3 components. They must have a low floor, a wide wall, and a high ceiling. And what that means is a low floor means there must be multiple access points for all kids to engage in the content. It's not just enough to give them the content and say, well, I gave it to them, they just didn't do it. Did we really give them access points? A wide wall means, are we valuing the large amount of prior knowledge that kids come into our classrooms with, both academically from their other schools, but also experientially from where they grew up, what they've done, where they traveled, if they're new to the country, what their experiences were before that. And then high ceiling means that we are not dumbing down. That's one of the comments that we hear sometimes, is that the NGSS lacks rigor. And if I could ban a single word from the NGSS discussion, rigor would probably be it, because I think anybody can make something hard for a kid and call it rigorous. And hard does not necessarily mean equitable, and it certainly doesn't necessarily measure what a kid should know about a particular piece of material. So high ceiling means that we include all ideas and that we don't lower at all the standards in the things that we're doing. And we actually began with the group work, because we know that a lot of times teachers, where we used to sit kids in rows, most teachers now are doing lots of group work, but we also know there are problems with group work, right? You have kids in your class who love group work because they don't have to do anything. They feel like, hey, if I can sit back and let the 3 quote unquote smart kids do the work, I'm going to get a really good grade. Or you have kids who hate group work because they end up doing not only their work, but everybody else's work, because if it's going to be created as a group project, they want to make sure they get a really good grade. So we started by looking at what can we change in our group work to make our tasks low floor, high ceiling, wide wall. And the idea was the development of what is known as group-worthy tasks. And in a group-worthy task, all members of the group are responsible for all the content. So you can ask anybody to explain the content in a model. You can ask anybody to create a scientific explanation, and it should be a random selection, and all the kids in the class or in that particular group should be able to do it. So I'm stuck again here. There we go. And so our group worthy tasks are, again, low floor, high ceiling, wide wall. They are three-dimensional. They are open-ended and require complex problem solving. They cannot be completed without the contributions of all group members. So what we oftentimes saw in group work was, okay, here's your project. Kids would split it up 4 ways, go off in their own directions, never talk to one another, and then come back and turn it in as a group project. If you've taught for any length of time, you've probably had kids turn in group work where they didn't even remember to like change the font in the different parts that each one of the kids did. And if you ask kid A about kid, C's work, they wouldn't have any idea. And then there's a group and individual accountability built into our group project. So that was our group worthy work. And then we finally landed on our grading. We realized that if we ask kids to think differently and to work differently, we have to be willing to grade differently. And we don't have a lot of time to go into grading, but in summary, our philosophy of grading changed to that our grading policies and our grading ways must engender hope for students. That if kids are in any way mathematically eliminated from passing a class almost at any point in the semester, it's going to be difficult to get them to buy into the work that we're asking them to do. So our grades have to engender hope and have to reflect the best of the student, not the worst of the student. And I'm happy to talk more about grading at a later date, but that was very important to us because at the end of the day, oftentimes kids or parents, that's really what they care about most. And getting them to understand what we're asking them to do with the NGSS shifts required us to rethink what we do with grading so we can have those conversations with kids and parents. If you are able to advance the slide, that would be great.
I'm not actually able to advance it. It was just luck last time, but I can take.
Oh, okay, there we go. Okay, so looking at some of the chat questions, yes, our geochemistry class, I'm not sure what exactly is meant by integrated, but it is just a geology course that has chemistry performance expectations embedded in. That's what that is. And so what the NGSS asks us to do is to go from these siloed classes into these somewhat integrated classes, though there is an integrated pathway, and that's not what I'm referring to here, but of using earth and space science phenomena to drive our life science and to drive our chemistry and to drive our physics lessons. And I'll show you some examples of that in a little bit. So we'll think about what that looks like is we sat down as teachers. So after we identified, we had to think about classroom ethos and redefining SMART and finding ways to assign agency and status to students. Then the next part was, all right, well, what about the content? What about the curriculum? Because at the end of the day, that's where our curriculum, we're in content experts in our classroom. So an example in biology we would use is a piece of material from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, HHMI. If you teach biology, I'm sure you are familiar with HHMI. And what we would do is we used to show a short video and just keep going where it introduced fossil evidence. And one of the shifts we made in embedding earth and space science phenomena is we just made this little shift here. So we'll show you this short video.
"10 million years ago, this Nevada desert was a lake full of sticklebacks. Their fossil remains have long fascinated Mike Bell.
Every year, many stickleback would die, and their bodies would drift to the bottom and be covered with sediment. The flesh would rot off the bones, and very often would leave a beautiful intact skeleton.
And we would show that clip and we would just keep going. And in our biology classes, we decided, hey, this is a great opportunity to engage kids with some Earth and space science phenomena. So we would stop the clip there, and we would give them these materials. We gave them really inexpensive materials. We make a joke that the dollar store is now the NGSS supply store, the science supply store since NGSS came out. We would use, these are paint trays in the orange that would represent a stream table. Our geology teachers have real actual stream tables, but we don't have enough of them because we have more biology students. So we would give them a stream table. We would give them a cup with holes in it. We would give them some sand, some water, and some washers of different sizes that would represent stickleback fossils. And we would simply say, create a model of how you could have fossils float to where there could be no lake, and yet fossils in different layers. And the models they were able to come up with and the discussions that they were able to have, and we would give them some additional reading, allow them to understand that fossil evidence that are in layers tells you something, and that some of the Earth and space science phenomena drove the formation of the fossils. And so they had a great opportunity to have a minds-on, hands-on experience during that lab. So there's the kids, and we had some pictures of them doing that lab. And so, you know, their model is the rain, and it's causing erosion, and that's going to cause fossil layers, sediments to be carried down and fossil layers to build up. They would then go through those fossil layers and find the fossils, and they would identify fossils, let's say, as older versus younger. And it was just a super quick and inexpensive, hands-on, minds-on way to introduce kids to the idea of fossil evidence. The other piece of evolution that we would do, and most of you are familiar with, is rock pocket mouse. And so we would use the HHMI resource, the rock pocket mouse, and we would show them this very, very short clip. You all probably have shown this if you are a life science teacher, and you probably skipped right past it to the part where they talk about allele frequency. But this is the part that we would show them.
Across the American Southwest, golden deserts dotted by cacti and brush stretch for miles. Yet here in New Mexico's Valley of Fire, the landscape changes dramatically. Patches of black rock interrupt the sand.
And we stopped it there. And we had never done that before. We've been showing this short film for years, and we had never stopped it there. But it's an amazing, wonderful question, is how did there get to be this black lava flow in the middle of the American Southwest desert? So we would show them that video. We would take Google images and show them what it actually looked like. And then we would, again, go to the science supply store or the dollar store, and we'd buy these cheap tins, like 79 cents each. We would melt some paraffin wax and black crayon. They'd get the same sand that had been dried out then from the previous lab, and a 10 milliliter syringe. And we would say, you have to model how there could possibly be a lava flow. Well, kids who don't have much of an earth science background, I mean, they would have lava raining from the sky like it was a plague from biblical times or something. And that would give us a chance to see what they were thinking. It would make their thinking visible that they didn't understand the lava flow had to come from underground somewhere. So we would have them redo their model. The advantage of using the wax is the wax dries in about 30 seconds, and you can pick the whole wax up and throw it away, and they can start again. You don't have to give them new sand. It's all nice and clean. And so they were able to draw their models. And then we gave them these little ponds, I think they're called. And they just ran of different colors. They just randomly dropped them in their American Southwest desert. And they noticed right off the bat that the dark ponds blended in better on the dark substrate and the lighter ones better on the light substrate. We taught evolution before genetics, so they didn't have an understanding of allele frequency or dominant recessive or anything like that at this point. So we embedded this Earth and space science piece into the natural selection, something we had never done. And then finally, the last piece around evolution was when we looked at the set with modification, we looked at Darwin's finches. And Darwin's finches were on the Galapagos Islands, and the formation of the Galapagos Islands was a really important part of the ecology of the islands. And we wanted them to think about how these islands, how can an archipelago form? So we gave them some wax again, and we had them cover a beaker with some sand and a little bit of water and put it on a hot plate. And we just let the hot plate warm up a little bit. It takes about 45 seconds. And what we had was the wax remelts, and you're able to see the wax come up out of the ocean floor, and you get a formation of an archipelago. And they understand that the island furthest away from the hotspot is the oldest, the one that's first formed. The one closest is the youngest. And it was a really authentic way in which to build in some Earth and space science into our geology unit. So that was the gist of our biology. For chemistry and physics, we used, again, an HHMI resource called Earth Viewer and Biome Viewer. And we had the kids explore with that. And then we introduced them to a wonderful resource developed by Jessica Bean. And it's on the HHMI website, and it's called Understanding Global Change. And the students were able to take these icons at the bottom and drag and drop them onto this picture, and then create arrows that were able to identify the carbon cycle. And so we use the carbon cycle as a way of merging chemistry to Earth and space science phenomena. I think you could also include that in physics. So as they dropped their icons, they then could pick the icons that they thought best described the relationship between climate change or the carbon cycle and chemical reactions. Once they identified what they thought were the most important parts, they were required to connect them by dots and by arrows. Notice the different thickness of the arrows represented more of a direct or indirect relationship. And then over here on the left-hand side, they had to write an explanation as to why those connections were made. And we were able to print those out, and we were able to use those as a formative assessment in the work that we were doing around carbon cycle. What's really cool about this particular resource, Understanding Global Change, is that you can download a picture and insert any picture into that original scene. So if I go back to the original scene, this is the original scene that we introduced kids with, but because phenomena should be anchored in a student's local environment, we were doing a workshop near the San Gabriel Mountains, so we were able to upload a picture of the San Gabriel Mountains, and they were able to take the same icons and do the same process, only in an ecosystem that they were most familiar with. So that was kind of a brief summary of what we try to do around building our chemistry, our physics, and our biology into our 3 dimensions. Additional ways in which we have supported districts in developing and implementing NGSS is some of the professional development workshops that we do. And they kind of basically fall in one of 5 categories. There's one there, accelerating into the NGSS, which is for districts that are maybe a little late to the table, but know that they need to make these shifts. So we have a series of workshops for them as well. 3-dimensional teaching in the classroom. It's a series of workshops that focuses specifically on building 3-dimensional skills. We also have a workshop around ethos and developing classroom ethos and what that looks like in a classroom more than just the first week of school, but throughout the year. And then finally, we have specific workshops around California's instructional segments in the living earth, in chemistry and earth systems, and physics in the universe. All of them driven through our earth and space science phenomena. So that's kind of a summary of some of the opportunities that are available. If you have other questions or would like to contact us, there is our email address, and we are pretty good at getting back to folks. And then if anything today caught your eye or was meaningful for you, that's our Twitter handle there. And not really sure how that all works. Samantha kind of does all that, but if it was helpful for you, you could let other people know. But thank you for taking your time and attending, and I'd love to answer any questions that you may have. We'll go from there.
We have a few questions, Jim. Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. Lots of interesting things for us all to think about. A couple questions came up in the chat box. One of them early on was thinking about how NGSS helps teachers discover what students are curious about so they can develop big questions and develop their ideas around the phenomena. So we kind of pair that question up with the idea of the classroom ethos and how you made this shift for redefining SMART. What does that really look like and feel like if you're a teacher or if you're on the faculty or staff there? How did that take place?
I think for us, it was first, our teachers had to believe that all of the students in their classroom belong there, and that a kid who came in with a perceived less of a background, let's say in math, when that kid did well, a public recognition of that kid doing well and defining SMART as not only right answers, but asking questions, because we all have had kids in our class that ask like the best questions. And then you look at their grade and they're getting a C- or a D+. And so it's recognizing that smartness takes many, wears many suits, and that a kid who asks a really great question is just as smart and valuable to the classroom as a kid who gives a really good answer, and just making that public when we recognize it in front of the classroom.
Great. And in terms of working with teachers to help them make that shift in the way their practice actually goes once they close the door, what kinds of things did you do with that? And then kind of a sidebar question to that is, you mentioned that you had the support staff involved in this process. How were they involved?
Okay, so the first part, to be honest, this doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow process. Oftentimes, like I'm old, and so this was really new to me. And a lot of us teach or want to teach the way we were taught. And so you're right, a teacher could close their classroom door and say, okay, I'm still going to do what I want to do at the end of the day. But I think one of the things that was helpful to us was our implementation team and our leadership team that Samantha headed up, where we met on a regular basis and shared student work and shared teacher work. So there was an opportunity for teachers to see what other teachers were doing. And it wasn't just at one site, it was across all sites at all the high schools in the district. We had a director of personnel that was it was very important to her that all kids in our district got equal opportunity in science, not just at one school or the other school. And so teachers opened their classrooms. We could walk into each other's classrooms at any time and announce and just hang out for a while if it was our prep period. And so there was that buy-in that we're all in this together, that none of us know exactly what we're doing, and that we're just going to do the best we can and make revisions as we go. The support staff, it was just the idea of supporting our teachers when you had pushback from parents who, you give a test and if it's not posted on whatever gradebook platform you're using in 24 hours, sometimes parents get all upset. But if you're given a real three-dimensional test, those have to be graded, and those take a longer time to grade. And so just having the support staff support us when parents called, having the support staff encourage kids to take classes that maybe they would have never thought to take. You mean I can take physics? Yeah, you should. You'd be great at it. Just those kinds of comments, I think, was what we tried to get all of our counselors, our administrators, our administrative assistants, all supporting kids in doing more than they thought that they could, kind of pushing them outside their comfort zone.
Kind of a procedural question. We had a couple of people ask if they could access the activities that you were showing.
Yes, so
if
they,
you maybe
they could.
in
If they,
slide somehow.
yes, if they email us, we can talk to them about how they could have access to the material. That wouldn't be a problem.
Just looking through the list of questions here. Question about misconceptions. So when you were working with the lava flow modeling with the wax and the fossil fish, it's common for students to think that islands float. Do they come up with that? And
yeah,
how does that fit into the discussion? Where does that go?
So that's a great question. So the first time we did that, we used lots of water because we were afraid, or I was afraid, that I didn't want the beaker to crack, right? So I put too much water in. And one of our geology teachers, and because I don't teach Earth and space science, I don't know the misconceptions that kids have, right? Like I think a great teacher, the differences between a great teacher and a good teacher is a good teacher knows the content, but a great teacher knows where kids get stuck and then can unstick them. And like that was a misconception that it didn't dawn on me that kids would have because I've never. So our geology teacher walked in when I was playing with this, and he oftentimes helps me and Samantha with our earth science stuff, and goes, if you put that much water in, kids are just going to think that the island's floating. We go, oh, are you really, like, kids think islands float? And he said, looked at me like I was crazy to even ask that question. And so we use as little water as possible. And then we ask the kids, okay, so, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So what are some limitations in this model that you can see? And that's one of the limitations the kids identify, is that the islands look like they're floating, but we use so little water that it's not so obvious that they're floating way above the substrate. But that's a great question.
Yeah. So I was curious in thinking about the progression through from freshman year to the physics course in junior year, and thinking back down into, your sending school, whether it was a junior high or middle school or whatever it was. Have you done work with those teachers to vertically align across from their level up into the high school to help with you? And, where do you get the time to do this, right?
Yeah.
Meetings, where do you get that time? How does that work?
Time and money are the two things that teachers have not enough of. And the thing they have too much of is meetings. So we try to solve that problem in this way, that our implementation team was TK through 12. So we had our kindergarten, our first grade teachers in with our AP physics teacher in the implementation team meeting. And at first there was a lot of people, the elementary school teachers were intimidated by the high school teachers, and the high school teachers my daughter's a third grade teacher and she's phenomenal. But we have no idea what it's like to teach the same kid all day long. And when we write a lesson plan for a sub, it's really only has to last 60 minutes or whatever your period is, but an elementary school teacher has all day. So we got to know each other from a personal standpoint and then a professional standpoint. And we then started building this coherence, not only between middle school and high school, but through TK into middle school. And the time was at the implementation team meetings. We met quarterly for 2 hours, but then the middle schools and high schools also once a month, we have a PLC where we meet the last Wednesday of every month. And then the following Thursday, we were able to get release time for teachers to be out of their classroom all day to build on the discussion that happened the following Wednesday. So we had a commitment from our district office people to build our science curriculum. There were no resources available, and they gave us both time and money during the classroom day And then teachers had to be willing to miss class, which we know is hard, but the work doesn't get done if teachers aren't out of the classroom at the beginning. And now they're not out very much anymore because the work is done. And now we have teachers calling each other. We have elementary school teachers calling high school teachers asking to borrow equipment. And it's just really beautiful.
Great, thanks. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Carla McAuliffe real quick to wrap us up. Carla?
Yes, thank you very much, Jim. We would like for you to please take a few moments and fill out our post-webinar survey. The link is in the chat box, so if you would please just take a few moments, it's very short, and fill that out now. It's very helpful for us, helps us think about what are important future topics. I also mentioned in the chat that we'll be posting the slides and the recording of the webinar from this webinar within a couple of days, and you will have access to that. Thanks for everyone for attending.
Okay.
I'd like to thank everybody also. I very much appreciate you giving up your time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jim. That was great. I think we had one more slide maybe at the end. Just a quick reminder that we do have monthly webinars. So our next webinar again will be on Valentine's Day. So the 14th of February, 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Registration information for that will be coming out in the next couple of days. So please watch your inbox for that. And Jim, thank you very much again. To everybody who attended, thank you for attending. You'll be receiving the link to the archived version of this shortly in your inbox. So please watch for that. And thanks for completing the evaluation. Hope you have a great rest of your day today. And thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.